I think that under the circumstances in this weather, we have to give an extra special thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you very much for coming out. And I would like to thank all the organizations that put their efforts into making this evening happen tonight. I'm not going to go through them. It's a long list, and you can find them on the flyer. Please take a look at who they are and do support them. These are organizations that put their heart and soul into supporting our community, supporting Israel, supporting us. So thank you to all those who have put their efforts into making tonight happen. And thank you to those outside on the street as well who have helped in the publicity for this event. It's actually, I can make a joke about it, but it's actually a bit of a serious issue. We were told there would be protesters outside. We were told that there will be protesters inside. If there is anybody among us who is here to protest, by all means, we're glad you're here. We're here to discuss. We're here to listen. We're here to talk. And you are certainly welcome among us. I unfortunately have to add to this. We won't have any interruptions in the course of the event. And in the course of the event, if there are any interruptions, we would ask you to please stay calm, relax. We have plenty of security here, plenty of security to take care of issues, and pay attention to the people around you, pay attention to the people around you who may need help. And I don't think anything will happen, but please, what else can one say? Anyway, on that note, I would like to call on Michael Mostyn of B'nai B'rith to introduce Caroline.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Good. First of all, I will name, thank you CAEF, thank you Toronto Zionist Council, Sherry Tefillah, and of course all of the sponsoring organizations for your assistance tonight. We're all very, very excited to hear from Caroline Glick. That's why we're all here tonight in this weather. When we think in our minds about a warmer climate, warmer times in the state of Israel, of course, it's a country that's near and dear to all of our hearts, but these are very challenging times for Israel, and they're challenging times for supporters of Israel. And that's why it couldn't be a better time for Caroline to come to Toronto today and speak to all of us so that we could hear from her, her analysis and her commentary, and we're very much looking forward to hearing that. She's somebody who really needs no introduction, but otherwise I wouldn't be up here at the podium and I'd just be talking. So I'm going to introduce her anyways very quickly. Caroline is the diplomatic commentator for Israel's Channel 14, the host of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour on Jewish News Syndicate, and the senior contributing editor of JNS, as well as a columnist at Newsweek. She is the senior fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy in Washington and a lecturer at Israel's College of Statesmanship. She previously served as the senior columnist for Israel Hayom, Israel's largest circulation newspaper, and from 2002 to 2019, she was the Jerusalem Post senior columnist and senior contributing editor and senior columnist at Ma'ariv. She was a core member of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians, an accomplished and award-winning author, journalist, and writer, a former policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. It is my pleasure to introduce Caroline Glick.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here in Toronto. And I want to thank, first of all, Paul Rotenberg, my old friend who brought me to Toronto the first time. And I spoke here at the synagogue. It was in 2004, 2005, before the expulsions from Gaza. And I remember it was a pretty dramatic moment in Israeli history then and a pretty dramatic time here in Toronto. And I remember it, especially standing here, I actually can see Izzy Kaplan, Zichrono Livracha, and Herb and Joyce, and so many others that were here at the time, and they're still with us in the halls of this synagogue today. I can still feel them here. And so it's a pleasure to be back here again now in 2023 to talk about what's happening today in Israel, also a time of domestic turmoil. And I wanted to just for a second say one of the things that's interesting whenever I talk about what's happening in Israel or what's happening about Israel in the West or where have you is that whatever the proximate discussion that we're having is about, it's always about the same thing, whether it's expulsion from Gaza, the conflict with the Palestinians, Iran, BDS, delegitimization of Israel on campuses in the West, or rising anti-Semitism. The question is always a question of time and space, but the actual question is always the same, and the question is always whether Israel has a right to exist or not, whether the Jews have a right to self-determination in our homeland or not, whether Jews in the diaspora have the civil right to be Zionist and to support Israel or not. The question of whether or not Israel has a right to exist is always there. It's always sort of the basic foundation of any discussion that you have about Israel at any particular moment. And today what we're finding is that there's a merger, a terrible merger, but a merger all the same between the people outside who say that Caroline Glick is a Nakba denier. That's a new one for me, but okay, I'll take it. And the people in Israel who on the left who are threatening civil war. And the people outside who are saying I'm a Nakba denier don't think that Israel has the right to exist. And the people in Israel threatening civil war and calling for the economic collapse of Israel, hearkening the day that Israel will collapse economically, are saying that Israel can only exist if they're in charge of it. So on the one hand, it's conditional, and on the other hand, we don't have a right to exist. But the fact that there's an open question about whether or not Israel should exist is sort of the pretext of both of them. And today, from the rostrum of the Knesset, Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, essentially called for the economic boycott and collapse of Israel and seemed to be wishing for this to happen. As the head of the opposition in Israel, and Simcha Rotman, the head of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, got up after Lapid and said, you are advocating BDS against this country. And he was right. That's exactly what's happening today. This is something that people don't really understand on the outside, but people on the inside have sort of seen this coming for a while. I've been writing now in the Israeli press and about Israel since 2000, so 23 years now. And I started writing about the problem of our judicial system and of our legal system about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And initially, I was the only one in the Israeli media that was regularly writing columns, not every week, but it continued to, it was a theme that was ongoing in my work from the very beginning of my career. And over time, more and more people came to realize that there was a significant issue with our legal system and that it required reform. And so, and to understand what's happening in Israel, you have to be aware that there's been an argument in Israel about the situation of our legal system for a very long time. It's just that our media is part of the problem, and they've been hiding the problems of our judicial system and of our legal system from the Israeli public and from the wider Jewish public in the diaspora for just as long as these problems have been going on. And so now that it's all burst into the headlines where there's an actual attempt by the government to reform the judicial system and the legal system, it seems like it's a bolt out of the blue. Where did this come from? So if you haven't been paying attention, you probably never heard about the problems of Israel's legal system. And now you're like, why are the heads of the opposition, why are 5 former chiefs of staff of the army and the former heads of the Shabak and the former commissioners of the Israeli police, why are all these people calling for civil war? Why are they all threatening civil war, and why are these unicorn investors and startups saying that they're going to take their money out of Israel? Where did this come from? What's happening? How did this happen? It seems like it came from nowhere. Well, it didn't come from nowhere. It's been going on for a long time. And I think that in order to even begin to approach what's going on in Israel, you have to kind of understand what's been going on and how have these things come about. And so, the first time that the right wing won an election in Israel was in 1977 when Menachem Begin, who had been the head of the opposition in Israel for the first 29 years of the state, or 28, the first Knesset came in 1949, suddenly won for the first time the election, and he formed a coalition government in 1977. And both at the time, in a very controversial move, and very controversial in retrospect, Begin didn't fire anybody when he came into office. So the state media, which had always been controlled by labor Zionists from the Labor Party, continued to be controlled by the Labor Party and labor Zionists. And in 1977, there was no other media than the state media. And so the left continued to control the media. He didn't fire anybody from the legal fraternity, so they stayed in power. He didn't fire anybody in the army. He didn't fire anybody anywhere. He kept all those people in, and all the loyalists that had been following him in the political desert for 29 years didn't get the jobs that they had thought that they were going to get after they had been shut out of all of these positions as part of the Labor Party's blacklist for 29 years. So Begin didn't change anything. And, a lot of people, one of the big bestsellers in Israel over the past several years, or a couple of years, has been a book that was written by a very close friend of mine named Erez Tadmor, which has not been translated into English, but it's called Why When You Vote Right, Do You Get the Left? And can you hear me? Because I'm hearing this echo from the microphone. At any rate, so at the time, and this is sort of an insight that I reached just a few days ago when I was thinking about it, because I've been sort of bitter about Begin for the past decade or so because of what happened, what he did not do when he came into office. But just a couple of days ago, in the midst of this maelstrom, it came to me that the reason why Begin didn't feel it necessary to fire anybody in what in America is now referred to as the deep state, and it's sort of the permanent Weberian state in Israel of the bureaucrats, is because in 1977, that permanent state in Israel was opposed to Begin. They hated him. They had been demonizing him for 28 years, or longer actually, since before the establishment of the state. And they hated him, and they thought that the state was going to be destroyed because he was the new prime minister. But on the other hand, they were informed by the Zionist ethos. They were Zionists. So they may have been opposition to the government. They may have hated the government, but they loved the country. And so he was used to being hated. He was used to having the opposition in charge. So it might have just been out of force of habit that he didn't think that there was anything to change there. At any rate, he didn't endanger the country by keeping them in power. He simply destabilized his own government because he kept people in who wanted to overthrow him. But it didn't endanger Israel. Beginning in 1992, when Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, was elected to form the government, we saw a 30-year period of first slow and then very fast radicalization of the left in Israel. You've experienced similar things they've experienced similar things in the United States, and I dare say it's happened here, not necessarily out of a real understanding or knowledge of the Canadian system, but simply because it's happened all over the Western world. That the left throughout the Western world has become radicalized, and the Israeli left became radicalized, beginning in 1993 with the recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in the beginning of the Oslo process, and we recognized them and we began negotiating with the PLO. And when that happened, it's a big, long story. I wrote a book about it. It was published in 2014 called The Israeli Solution, a One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East. And the first half of the book is an analysis of why the peace process with the Palestinians failed. But essentially, the minute that the Israeli left accepted the Palestinians or the PLO as a legitimate actor, this was the group that was the pioneer of modern terrorism, and the PLO has always served as a nexus where the jihad meets with the Soviet Marxist model of totalitarianism, so that you have the red-green alliance is manifested perhaps most in its purest form in the PLO. And the PLO narrative at its heart rejects Israel's right to exist. I began my remarks by saying every discussion about Israel always ends up being about whether or not it has the right to exist. Well, the PLO knows where it stands on that issue. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Everything that the PLO stands for is animated by the negation of Israel. They appropriate our history. They destroy the historical record of Jewish civilization in the land of Israel by plowing through archaeological sites from the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through Joshua and the Maccabees, King David, and all the rest. They're just plowing them under, financed by the EU. They pretend that they are the descendants of the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Philistines and whatever else, the Hittites and all of the other nations. This is all a lie. It's all fabricated. But they do it in order to appropriate as Jewish history. They develop blood libels about every single battle between terrorists and the IDF. Just today there was such a battle in Shechem. And already we see the nations of the world lining up to condemn Israel for killing 11 terrorists in a gun battle in Shechem. So, I mean, this is what the PLO does. This is their modus operandi. This is their modus vivendi. And when the Israeli left embraced the PLO, they essentially embraced also that narrative, that there is something fundamentally immoral about Israel's existence. And that obviously has had a pathological effect on them, because if you accept as legitimate the concept that there's something wrong with the existence of your state, then that's a very radicalizing position to be taking. And that's one of the main reasons, not the only one, but a major reason, a major source of the radicalization of the Israeli left. There are others, but that's not the primary focus of this talk, so I don't want to go into it too deeply. But then in 2000, the radicalization started going into overdrive. Why? Because the myth that you could make peace with the PLO crashed and burned at the Camp David summit when Arafat rejected statehood in all of Gaza and 95% of Judea and Samaria, including the partition of Jerusalem and the transfer of sovereignty over the Temple Mount to the PLO. And instead of accepting that state, he went to war against Israel and started massacring Israelis throughout the country. And so you would have thought that when that happened, and initially there was an awakening on the part of leading Israeli leftists like Ehud Barak, Shlomo Ben Ami, who was the foreign minister and the head of the Israeli negotiating team, and others who acknowledged that there was nothing positive about the Palestinian national ethos, that it was entirely negative and pathological. But then, after that initial awakening and reconciling with reality, the Israeli left faced a choice. Either reject Oslo, reject the PLO narrative, and go back to being normal Zionists, or move even further to the left. And after that initial awakening, they then turned around and became even more radical. And so now what we have is a left that is basically predicated on two major things. One is anti-Zionism, and you see that in a lot of different, in Meretz party is no longer Zionist, Labor Party under Merav Michaeli may call itself Zionist, but in practice there's nothing Zionist about their positions on anything, to post-Zionist, to Benny Gantz, who during his tenure as defense minister essentially gave the PLO and the EU free rein over Area C, and they have proceeded to carry out illegal construction that essentially turns almost every Israeli community in Judea and Samaria into an isolated enclave because it's surrounded by illegal Palestinian building. And so, this is on that level. And then on the other level, they become nihilist. So somebody like Yair Lapid with a 10th grade education, who is now the head of the opposition. He has the largest left-wing party, Yesh Atid, with 24 mandates. And he doesn't have any clear ideological position on anything because he's constantly contradicting himself, because words for him have no meaning. He says whatever sounds good at any particular moment, and you can just look at his statements, and it sounds ironic what I'm saying, but it's actually true. I mean, my colleague and friend Gadi Taub, he points out every single time there's literally no meaning or significance to anything that Yair Lapid says, because the next day he'll contradict himself 180 degrees. And so, and he doesn't blush. I mean, and that's pretty extraordinary. So on the one hand, you have a radicalism, and on the other hand, you have a nihilism that are the guideposts of the Israeli left. And so then we go back to their continued control over the permanent bureaucracy. So in 1992, Aaron Barak oversaw the passage in the Knesset of something called the Basic Law, Human Dignity and Freedom, okay? And almost nobody showed up to the vote. It was passed with 32 votes against 21 votes in the Knesset. So a minority of members of Knesset were even there at the time they passed this law. And the reason nobody voted was because nobody thought it was important. They thought that this was just a sort of fluffy, nice, feel-good kind of basic law. We're all for human dignity and freedom. And Aaron Barak turned around in an extremely controversial move and transformed this basic law that was passed sort of as an afterthought. Nobody actually was thinking about it at all, and almost nobody voted, let alone voted for it. You have a quarter of the people in the Knesset voting for a bill. It means that nobody thought it was important. And he turned this into Israel's constitution. And he used it as a basis for arrogating to the Supreme Court in 1995 the power to overturn laws duly promulgated by the Knesset. And he made that decision in a court case in 1995, a week after Rabin was assassinated, when absolutely nobody was paying attention to anything that he was doing. And it was about a minor issue that nobody cared about. So when nobody was looking, he transformed this nothing law into the basis for a fake constitution. And on the basis of this fake constitution, he seized for himself and his colleagues the power to cancel laws of the Knesset. And then over the intervening years, since 1995, the Supreme Court has arrogated to itself, seized for itself with no legal basis, more and more powers from the Knesset. Not only do they now have the power to cancel laws, but they have also seized for themselves the power to dictate the laws that they demand the Knesset pass, which is something that has no parallel in any country in the world, that not only does the Supreme Court cancel laws, but then it dictates to the legislature what laws they have to pass in explicit detail, which is pretty extraordinary. And then when the right finally figured out this whole basic law thing that, oh, we're going to pass a basic law and make it a constitutional basis for future laws. So they passed the law, Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, in 2017. The Supreme Court decided that they have the right to cancel their own constitution that they created. So now they have a petition before them to cancel the basic law, Israel is the Jewish state of the Jewish, the nation state of the Jewish people. So they're saying that they can cancel laws on the basis of the Constitution that they created out of whole cloth, and then they said, well, they also have the right to cancel the Constitution. So this is something that is outrageous. So they're seizing for themselves powers, and they're saying that there are no limits on their powers. They make the basis of their power grab basic laws, and then they say that they can cancel the basic laws upon which they have seized their powers. So this is an extraordinary situation that has no parallel in any democracy in the world. But that's not all, because at the same time, they canceled the standing requirements for petitioners to the Supreme Court. So, in the United States, and I would assume in Canada, if somebody wants to petition the Supreme Court, they actually have to have some interest in the situation. They have to be harmed by some government policy or another, or law, personally harmed. But in Israel, Aaron Barak canceled standing requirements for petitioning the Supreme Court. So this opened up a cottage industry of NGOs that are political organizations, but they present themselves as human rights organizations, civil rights organizations, and they petition the Supreme Court not only about laws, but about government policies. And in the United States, if you petition the Supreme Court because you've been personally harmed by an action taken by the federal government, well, you don't actually petition the Supreme Court, right? You file a lawsuit. You file a lawsuit in a federal district court, and if you don't like the result, the judgment, or if the government doesn't like the judgment, then one of you appeals to an appellate court. And if one of you doesn't like the judgment of the appellate court, then you submit an appeal to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court only adjudicates a dispute after it's been adjudicated by 2 levels of federal courts, or by a state Supreme Court for that matter. And then, so this is years later, right? So the Supreme Court is not going to be interfering in a government policy in real time. Well, the Supreme Court seized for itself the right to sit in real time on policies that have just been adopted, whether it's military tactics in the middle of a war, or it's government policies for how to imprison inmates in a jail, or what to do about a hunger strike by Palestinian terrorists in jail, or anything else. The Supreme Court comes in real time and has taken for itself the power to cancel military orders, to declare a military operation while it is being carried out to be disproportionate and therefore illegal and must be stopped in the middle, and to interfere in real time with government policies on every single issue: economic, military, strategic, education, everything, religion and state. Now, one of the problems with this is that the power of a democracy, the staying power of a democracy, the health of a democracy, is that, we never agree on anything, on everything, not on anything. There are different camps in any country, let alone the Jewish country, right, where people disagree. But democracies know how to do things like trade horses, right, and log roll. And, okay, I'll give you this if you give me that. And you make a compromise. And nobody gets everything he wants, And nobody gives up everything that he wants. And that's how you're able to continue to live together even when you have significant differences of opinion about how things should be done. Because democracies and democratic politics, both at their best and at their worst, are about compromise. But when a court comes in to rule on something, or a legal advisor comes in to make a judgment about something, an opinion about something, they aren't about compromise. They're about setting down and dictating what must be. That's just the nature of the beast, right? You go to a court, they render a judgment. A judgment says this, that, or the other. One side will win, and the other side will lose, right? And that, the rule of lawyers is antithetical to democracy because, again, there's no compromise in the rule of lawyers. There's a judgment. There's a dictated end. And then what? Well, that would be bad enough in and of itself. But the Supreme Court, not only do they interfere in government policies in real time, and again, there's no legal basis for any of their action. This is all stuff that they seized for themselves on the basis of what Barak called his judicial revolution. Not only is there no limits to their powers, they're also the final court. You can't appeal. If they do something you don't agree with, you're stuck because you can't appeal their rulings because there's no override. So, and not only did they do this for the court, but they did this for the Attorney General, who's supposed to be the legal advisor to the government, but he is actually appointed indirectly by the Supreme Court. And they decided, apropos of nothing, again, with no basis in law, that the decisions of the Attorney General and all of the legal advisors and all of the government ministries are binding on the ministers and on the government. So if an Attorney General, who you may not even have chosen because they're just left over from the previous government, as is the case today, says that what you're doing is illegal, you're not allowed to do it anymore. She, in this case, the present one is a female, she didn't get elected by anybody, but she says that Aryeh Deri, who got the votes of 400,000 Israelis, is not allowed to be a minister in the government. You have 11 Supreme Court justices who agree with her, and they disenfranchise retroactively 400,000 Israelis who voted for him because they can. How can they? Because they said they can, and there are no limits on their power. So over time, initially, Israelis had no idea what was going on. This happened, again, he seized for the court Barak in 1995. The week Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, he seized the power to abrogate laws in some economic case that nobody cared about and nobody was paying attention to, and before we knew it, we had a completely different regime. Now again, when Begin didn't take control of the civil service, when he didn't fire people and put in his people, which is of course how it works in most countries, it's the top levels of government ministries, I don't know, I would assume in Canada, certainly it's true in the United States, are political appointees. Because these are policy-making positions, and you want them to be filled by people who are on the side of the government that you just elected to enact and implement their policies. So in Israel, it's not that way. Except for the director general of a ministry, essentially everybody is permanent civil service. So when Begin did it, it was bad for him, but it wasn't necessarily bad for Israel because these people hadn't been radicalized. But when you have a situation 30 years after the Oslo process started where you have a radicalized left and they're in control, then it starts becoming a completely different kettle of fish. Because not only are they antagonistic towards the government, but many of them are antagonistic towards Zionism. So I said that there was this cottage industry of NGOs that were formed They are massively financed by foreign governments, and they act as their agents. And I'll just give you an example. There are, a report just came out from Im Tirtzu, another NGO, a right-wing one, that started as a student movement on campuses, a Zionist student movement, and now they also do other things. So they just did an analysis of the petitions to the Supreme Court from 2017 to 2022, so 5-year period, the previous 5 years. And they found that during that 5-year period, foreign governments financed, I think it was 38 NGOs to the tune of 300 million shekels. It's nearly $100 million. And to petition the Supreme Court to interfere with government policies. The Norwegian government, in a leaked report that came out a few years ago, said that the specific purpose of these petitions to the Supreme Court was to gum up the works of the government, to paralyze the government, to subvert Israel's functioning as a state, to make it impossible for the government to enact policies. This is specifically in relation to to Judea and Samaria and the Palestinians, but it's also true for Israeli Arabs. So you have foreign government funding 300 million shekels to use the Supreme Court to subvert the will of the people of Israel as that will was manifested at the ballot box. Okay, so that's pretty amazing. And all of this sort of came like one by one, constituent group after constituent group, minority group after minority group in Israel, settlers who saw their property rights were being trampled upon by the activists on the court, on the one hand, ultra-Orthodox Jews who saw that their ability to maintain their observance in the public square was being diminished by the Attorney General on the one hand and the Supreme Court on the other hand. Residents of working class neighborhoods in South Tel Aviv, whose neighborhoods had been turned into crime zones because of the influx of illegal aliens from Sudan and Eritrea who were doing everything from plundering their stores to raping their mothers and children, and their rights were being trampled by the court that time after time. 3 laws of the Knesset to get the illegal aliens out of Israel were abrogated by the Supreme Court. And then a 4th law, which was suggested by the Supreme Court and was passed by the Knesset, was again canceled by the Supreme Court after they said, well, you can do this. So they get no respite from their suffering because the Supreme Court blocks every single effort by the government and the Knesset to protect them that passes. So they were added to the list, soldiers were added to the list. And then Benjamin Netanyahu found himself under criminal investigation and indicted for bribery and breach of trust. Breach of trust is a pretend crime that you use because you can capture almost anything inside of it. So initially, when the
Water, if you want.
Oh, thanks. So initially, when the investigations began, I was reporting then for the Jerusalem Post and Ma'ariv, and the things that he was being accused of, there was these regulatory violations, were already proved in real time to have not happened. But they continued on, and the media was getting illegal leaks from the police and from the state prosecution during the course of a 3-year criminal probe of Netanyahu that were just lying about what was happening inside of the investigations. This, and so I was reporting on this, but the media every night, primetime news, all of the legal reporters were basically working for the Justice Ministry. They're just saying what the prosecution and what the police investigators were saying. At any rate, so they destabilized the political system in Israel by first investigating the prime minister. He was indicted while he was in the White House with President Trump in January of 2020, and President Trump was presenting his peace plan that included the application of Israeli sovereignty to all of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria and to the Jordan Valley. And you had a split screen at home in Israel. On the one hand, here is Trump recognizing our sovereign rights in Judea and Samaria, and here is Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit announcing that he was planning on indicting the Prime Minister of Israel. Okay, this is how we saw it at home. So it was undermining key strategic initiatives of the government at the same, and while elections were ongoing in Israel, to destabilize the political system. Okay, so he gets indicted, and his trial begins. And I initially had thought that what had happened was, I mean, they invented, they redefined the statute for bribery in a way that doesn't appear in the legal code, to say that the receipt of or solicitation of positive coverage from a news source by a politician is the solicitation of a bribe, and the profference of positive coverage to a politician by a media organ is a bribe. Now, this means that every single politician and every single journalist can be indicted for bribery any time that a prosecutor wants to. If I write something nice about Netanyahu, then I am giving him a bribe, by definition, because they just said that was bribery. This is insane, all right? So that's what, I said at the time. I thought that what had happened was that they had been looking at things that Netanyahu had done, and then he did them, whatever they were, and then after the fact, they redefined them as crimes. So that I thought that he would definitely be found guilty because he had done the things that they said he had done. It's just that when he did them, they weren't a crime, and then they redefined them after the fact as a crime, and therefore they were going to put him in jail. So that's what I had thought, innocently. But it works out it was even worse than that. He didn't actually do any of these things. I mean, the things that aren't criminal that he was accused of doing, that they said were crimes after the fact, he never even did. He didn't solicit positive coverage, and he didn't receive positive coverage. All of the coverage that he got from the news source in question was terrible. Okay? And the solicitation of positive coverage from this news source involved press releases from his office. Like, you can't make this stuff up. And then in the meantime, so we've had, maybe 30 prosecution witnesses out of a total of, 500 that are on the list that the prosecutors submitted have already testified. And either under direct or cross-examination, all of them have been transformed. This is the prosecution's case, not the defense's case. Every single one of them have turned on the witness stand into witnesses for the defense. All of their claims, even the most antagonistic witnesses against Netanyahu, upon being cross-examined by his attorneys, have turned into defense witnesses. The entire investigation, the whole indictment has fallen apart, one after the, and it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that, because it works out that the prosecutors and the police investigators were also committing felonies in the course of their investigation of Netanyahu. They tortured witnesses. They extorted statements by witnesses against Netanyahu, threatening their parents, threatening their children, threatening their marriages, threatening their bank accounts. And they were innocent of everything. They weren't even suspected of any wrongdoing. They placed counterterrorism listening devices inside of the cell phones of the prime minister's top advisors illegally. I mean, these are listening devices that you use when you're tracking Hamas terrorists, and they put it into the cell phones of the prime minister's children, of the prime minister's top advisors, including a microphone so that they could illegally wiretap the prime minister in real time. These are things that, like, who would have ever thought of doing something like this? Well, it works out that the prosecutors who are now saying that the prime minister and the government want to destroy democracy through judicial reform, they did it. They did it. And so you see, well, this is what happens when you have a left that is in control of the permanent bureaucracy, and over the past 30 years has either been radicalized or become nihilist postmoderns that are just bereft of any values, except for the will to power. And this is what we're facing in Israel. So this brings me to the legal reforms that we're talking about. What are they? Why are we seeing 100,000 people in the streets calling for blood, calling for civil war, saying that this government is fascist and that it's going to destroy Israeli democracy? Well, they're nothing like what I wanted them to do. Basically, right now, we're talking about 4 reforms. 4. The first reform is to change the way that justices are selected. So the original sin of judicial overreach in Israel is the way that we choose judges in Israel. So I understand that in Canada you have politicians choose the justices. Is that correct? Or you have some system in which politicians have the upper hand in selecting justices. In the United States, it's an entirely political process. The president.
The prime minister appoints the justices.
So it's like America, except in the American system, which I am familiar with, you have the president nominates not only the Supreme Court justices, but also the federal district and appellate court judges, right? And then they have to be approved by the Senate. They go through hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and you can watch them on C-SPAN, and then there's a vote in the committee, and then it goes out into the full Senate for approval, right? So this is completely political. In Israel, it's completely judicial. We have this weird system where we have a judicial selections committee whose hearings are held in secret. There's no transparency. Nobody knows anything about the nominees for judicial positions in Israel except for the members of the committee. There are 9 members of the committee. You have 3 Supreme Court justices and 2 members of the Bar Association, which is completely beholden to the judiciary. So the justices have 5 out of 9 members. Then of the other 4 members, you have I think 3, you have the justice minister, 2 more members of the coalition, and 1 member of the opposition. So the government has 3 out of 9 seats in a 9, no, I'm sorry, they only have 2. So I can't remember how the other 2 pan out. I know 1 is a member of the opposition and the other is a member of the. What's that? There you go. So the coalition has 3 out of 9 members. Who has the majority? 3 judges, 2 members of the Bar Association out of 9, that makes 5. 5, last I checked, is a majority. That means, and you have 2 members can veto. So not only can they, so that means that even if the coalition is able to get a majority by getting members of the Bar Association on their side, the justices of the Supreme Court can still veto whoever they bring up. So that means that either through veto power or through voting power, the Supreme Court controls the membership, not only of the Supreme Court, but of the district court and of the magistrate court. So we have a self-selecting judiciary. They choose themselves. And the politicians get to make suggestions. Okay, this is something I don't think happens anywhere else in the world. So they control who gets in the court, and guess what? I know you'd be shocked to hear that they all kind of think the same about absolutely everything. Even the conservatives on the court do, because they have to pass through that initial obstacle of getting onto the Supreme Court. So even the ostensible conservatives are of the same mind in terms of judicial philosophy, even as conservatives. So the first change that they want to make is they want to give the politicians control over the judicial selection process. They want there to be hearings in the open so that people can actually see, not for all judges, but for Supreme Court justices. So that's what they want. They want politicians to have control over who gets to be a justice. The Supreme Court is still going to have members on the selection committee, but the balance is going to be turned on its head so that the politicians have the automatic majority and the judges get to make suggestions. I don't think they should be on the committee at all. I think that that's ridiculous. But okay, this is a compromise because they're trying to, get as many people on board as possible. So that's the first thing that they want to do. They want to change the Judicial Selection Committee. The second thing that they want to do is to limit the court's powers to overturn policies and legislation by taking away this very weird concept that we have in Israel, which is that judges get to rule that something is illegal or not allowed based on reasonableness. Now, what happens if I think something is reasonable that you disagree with? Say, I think it's completely reasonable to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. Well, that's my opinion. Now, you can come to me and say, well, there's all of this evidence that smoking is bad for your health and it's unreasonable to smoke, let alone smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. I can come back to you and say, well, smoking a pack of cigarettes gives me great pleasure. Makes me very, very happy, and I'm very unhappy and sad when I don't smoke. I say this as a former smoker, so I know what I'm talking about. But, and I say this, and I feel in my heart that smoking a pack of cigarettes is a fantastic thing and absolutely reasonable. Well, who's right? Well, unfortunately, it's rather subjective, isn't it? And this is something that you can make an objective case against smoking. But it's still subjective. Why is my opinion less good than your opinion? I think something's reasonable, you think it's unreasonable. Well, who are you to say it's my life? But that's the problem. The judges decided that they get to decide what's reasonable. So they decided last month that it's unreasonable to respect the votes of 400,000 Israeli voters who cast their ballots for Shas, led by Aryeh Deri, with the full expectation that he would be a senior government minister. Well, they didn't think that was reasonable. So they banned him from the government and barred him from serving as a minister. What's the basis in law? There is no basis in law, but they felt it was unreasonable. And this goes on in judgment after judgment after judgment. They think it's unreasonable for us to use Palestinians to knock on the door of a terrorist house so that they can find out if he's there instead of endangering our soldiers. No, that's not reasonable. They stop it in the middle. You can't do it anymore. Why? Because we think it's unreasonable. Well, the commander in the field thought it was really reasonable, but who is he to judge against a Supreme Court justice who knows nothing about what's happening on the ground? They know better. They think it's unreasonable, therefore you have to stop your operation in the middle. You are constrained in what you can do on the battlefield because 13 Supreme Court justices think it's unreasonable. Who elected them? Well, they elected themselves. Who gave them the power to decide? Well, they did. Is there a law involved here? No. But it's unreasonable, and they said they get to judge things by their reasonableness. And it's their decision, not yours, Mr. Battalion Commander, Mr. Chief of Staff of the IDF. None of your business. So the second reform that the government wants is to ban Supreme Court justices from basing their judgments based on the reasonableness standard. They say, no, you know what? You can interfere. We're not saying, God forbid, we should say that you can't interfere in military operations. We're just saying that if you interfere, why don't you do it from your lane of law? Why don't you say that it's illegal to do this and show us what law makes it, whatever it is, illegal? You're lawyers, you're judges. You're supposed to adjudicate laws, not reasonableness. Okay? That's it. That's all. Do whatever you want, but base your rulings on the law. So this is really, really radical, right? We have a Supreme Court president, Esther Hayut, who said at the outset of her tenure as Chief Justice that she didn't believe that the law had any reason that it shouldn't even be relevant. She said this because the justices have something, it's that special spice. Special spice, that's what she said. Special spice, they have a special spice that tells them what reasonableness is, and that they shouldn't have to be bound by the law in their judgments, which is amazing. And she said it proudly. Okay? So they said, no more reasonableness. You have to actually base your judgments on law. The third thing that they said in the reforms that, according to Yair Lapid and all of his crazy friends, are going to transform Israel into a fascist state, is they said, you know what, legal advisors are advisors, and if they make a ruling, then it's just an advisory opinion, and we don't have to listen to it. And by the way, we can hire, they didn't even say we're going to fire you, which they should, and hopefully they will in subsequent reform packages. They just said, we get to hire on my dime as a taxpayer, right? We get to hire outside attorneys to represent us before the Supreme Court if our legal advisor refuses to represent our positions in court. This is going to transform Israel into a fascist state, right? That the Minister of Science, to take a case from last year or 2 years ago, he doesn't want to give the Israel Prize to a scientist from the Weizmann Institute who has been going abroad and calling for academic institutions to boycott Israel. Okay? He doesn't think that this guy, whatever his scientific credentials may be, is worthy of the Israel Prize because he's going around the world telling other academics at other universities, by the way, while we're paying his salary, to boycott Israeli academic institutions, including his own at the Weizmann Institute. Okay? So the science minister says, hey, I don't want to give him the Israel Prize. And a bunch of radical academics petitioned the Supreme Court, demanded that the Supreme Court give him the Israel Prize. And the science minister said, well, I want the legal advisor for the science ministry to represent my position before the Supreme Court. And the legal advisor to the science minister refused because he agreed that this guy should get the Israel Prize. And he wouldn't represent the science minister. So you have Ophir Akunis, who is not a lawyer, standing by himself in front of the Supreme Court because he didn't have legal representation, trying to plead with the court to let him not give the Israel Prize to somebody who hates Israel. And the court said, no, we agree, you have to give him the Israel Prize. Why? Well, that's that special spice. It's a special spice. It's like a Big Mac, you know? And we got the special sauce. So they said, no, he has to get the prize. Okay, so the idea is that actually if the legal advisor of the science ministry tomorrow doesn't want to represent the science minister in a petition, then the science minister gets to hire a lawyer to represent him. That's it. That's going to turn Israel into a fascist state, right? And then the last one, let me just remind myself, procedure for canceling laws. So I said in 1995, while everybody's head was turned because Rabin had just been murdered, the court seized for itself the power to abrogate laws. But since they seized it, and it wasn't actually legislated, there were no limits to their powers. There was no delineation of their powers to overturn duly promulgated laws. They could just do whatever they want because this was just a legal, black hole. The Knesset had never even considered the possibility that the Supreme Court would overturn laws. So my view all through the years when I was writing about this was that power was seized without legal basis and it should be canceled, with legal basis. And so I thought that they should just not allow the Supreme Court to continue to cancel laws. Well, Yariv Levin, the justice minister, is trying to be, to compromise. So he said, no, but what we want to do is we want to set limits on this power. We want to set limits on this power. We want to stipulate the means for the overturn of laws, and we want an override clause so that there is an appeal. So, for instance, I'll just give you the last example here, which is drafting Haredim. Right? Nobody likes it. But again, this is the stuff of democracy. It's about compromise. Right? You have one side that, you have the Haredi Yeshiva Buchers who, because of this compromise that David Ben-Gurion reached with the Haredi rabbis in 1948, they don't serve in the army. Now, I think that's not good for them. I certainly don't think it's good for the army. We could use another division. It would be great, and that's basically what we sacrifice because they don't serve in the army. But they reached various compromises through the years about how to deal with this, how to limit the deferrals of military service for Haredi men, how to integrate them into the workforce, how to do all kinds of things, workarounds, limited mobilization, all kinds of things. But this, again, this is the stuff of democracy, right? This is compromising. This is getting together, and the Haredi parties have a relative political power that they can use as leverage, and they do, to expand the number of deferrals. And you reach compromises over time in order for people to be able to live together. So again, the court comes and bludgeons compromise after compromise. We had 5 elections in 4 years in Israel. They all started. We went into this maelstrom of political instability for 2 reasons. One was the indictments of Netanyahu, but the other one, and the proximate cause for the first election in April of 2019 that were supposed to be held in November of 2019. They were held in April of 2019 because the Supreme Court said that if you don't pass a law on Haredi military service along the lines that we dictate, then the government is going to collapse. You have to do this or the government collapses. So the government couldn't do it because it wasn't a compromise. It was a dictate. It just doesn't work like that. You're trying to put one model of authoritarianism on top of a parliamentary democracy, and the parliamentary democracy collapses. And that's what happened, and that's why we went to new early elections in April of 2019. It was because of the draft law. And so they said in the proposed reform, there are going to be limits on what the Supreme Court can do in terms of overturning laws. There has to be an absolute majority of justices. First of all, you can't have a 3-judge panel, which is what they use, just a regular 3-judge panel to overturn Knesset laws. No, I think you need either 13 or all 15 justices to be sitting, and you have to have a majority of, 80% of justices in order to overturn a duly promulgated law. And the Knesset has an override power. So if the Supreme Court overturns a Knesset law, then the Knesset can pass it again with an absolute majority of 61 out of 120. Okay? So not like, the human dignity and freedom law from 1992 that 32 members of Knesset passed, but actually you need 61 members of Knesset to overturn a Supreme Court decision. And that's important because, again, if there's no appeal of what they're doing, then they're not part of the democratic process. They're just an authoritarian institution that comes down and smothers and crushes the democratic institution of the country, the Knesset. So here it's saying the Knesset, under these circumstances, the justices can abrogate laws, and under these circumstances, the Knesset can then just go back and say, no, we need this compromise, or we need this law. We want to get rid of the illegal aliens in South Tel Aviv. We want to do these things. We have to do these things. We have accountability to our voters, as opposed to the Supreme Court justices, particularly now, under the current selection system, are accountable to no one but one another. So they have all of the power that they've seized from the Knesset and the government, but they have no accountability. They don't have to give an accounting to voters. Only the politicians who have been effectively neutralized by the justices are accountable to voters. They're the only ones who have to explain why 80-year-olds are being raped by Eritrean illegal aliens in their homes, okay? They're the ones who have to give an accounting. The justices don't. So the whole thing is just to try to place limits on the authority of the Supreme Court, like those that exist in every other functioning democracy in the world, and to put limits on that power. That's all it is. And it's not even to take back all the powers that they seized from the government and the Knesset. It's to take back some of the powers, like the power to legislate, like the power to make laws based upon what the people's representatives think is reasonable and in the public interest, as opposed to unelected judges. That's all it is. That's a whole package. And over this package, people are rioting in the streets and calling for civil war. People are saying that Israel is not going to be a democracy anymore. People are saying that Israel should be economically sanctioned, that our credit ratings should be lowered, right? This is what's happening as a result of this reform, which doesn't even satisfy me, okay? You know, and I vote, but what am I going to do? It's about compromise. And I say, you know, if they're willing to accept some limits on their power, then we're already discussing something. The problem here is they're not willing to accept any limits on their power, and that's why they won't sit down and talk. You know, one of the people who I think has emerged as a real hero in Israel, somebody that I would never vote for, and that's President Herzog. Why do I think he's a hero? Because he put down a compromise proposal, which I don't like. But what did he do? He put down a compromise proposal. He accepted the basic legitimacy of the process. He said, oh, gosh, you know what? Elections have consequences. The people gave 64 mandates in a 120-seat Knesset to right-wing parties that had all run on a platform of judicial reform. They gave 46 mandates to the left-wing parties that had all run on a platform of no judicial reform. Who won? Golly, you know, I didn't do great in math, but I think that 64 is more than 46. You add to that 10 mandates for the Arab parties that have separated themselves from this entire question. So 46, no judicial reform. 64, yes, judicial reform. The yeas have it. And the president, as opposed to Ehud Barak, Aaron Barak, Esther Chayut, the standing Supreme Court president, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, Bogi Ya'alon, Dan Chalutz, all of these people, they don't recognize that 46 is less than 64, but the president does. And the president recognized something else. We're all supposed to be Zionists here. We're all supposed to care about the state. And we're all supposed to oppose civil war and insurrection and violence and riots and threats to murder the prime minister. We're supposed to all oppose these things. And he's like a lone voice. And the protesters in the street are damning him for daring to say that the government of Israel is legitimate and that the Knesset of Israel is legitimate. So, I mean, I consider that to be heroic because he's on the left. That's why I say I would never vote for him. He doesn't represent my positions on a whole host of issues, but he is like the left in 1977. He may disagree with me on what to do with the Palestinians and on 101 other issues. But he agrees with me that Israel's existence is not conditioned on anything, and that the vote of the people is legitimate and democratic. And he likes democracy. What an idea. And my hope is that because we have Herzog in the president's house demanding that people sit down and come to a compromise, that eventually, and I already see, chips in the wall falling, the leftist politicians who right now are acting like, revolutionaries who want to storm the Bastille, that some of them are going to wake up and walk this back. And if they do, it'll be thanks to him that they did, because he is telling them that they have to, and nobody else is. The media in Israel, and this is the last point, and I'll leave it with this. The media in Israel has become, they put Pravda to shame. When I was in 2003, I was an embedded reporter with the 3rd Infantry Division in Iraq. And one of the soldiers came up to me and he asked me, I loved them because they all called me ma'am, and I just thought that was precious. But, ma'am, why did you become a reporter? And I said, well, I became a reporter because the media was so biased that I figured I might as well just do it myself. And he looked at me and he was dumbfounded, and he said, and I said, what? And he said, well, I never heard anybody talk like that. And I loved it. 20 years later, I'm telling this story because it was fantastic. But okay, so the media is biased is one thing, but the media here is a full actor. We had this incredible scene, and I'll just give you I'll give you 2 stories about the media so you understand just how disastrous this is. So the first one came out last week, which is quite stunning. This Arab-Israeli reporter named Ali Mughrabi was working for Channel 13 News. And I don't even remember how it came out, but it was protocol was leaked of a investigation by the Second Broadcast Authority in Israel that's responsible for Channel 12 and 13 and 14. And so they had this hearing with this reporter, Ali Mughrabi. He had reported, he wanted to broadcast this report that he had put together that showed that the head of the Arab party, Hadash, Ayman Uda, who's the head of the Joint Arab List, that he had been laundering millions of shekels for the Palestinian Authority and was also responsible for prostitution ring for Palestinian Authority ministers. So this is like kind of a huge story. I mean, like not a little one. It's large, right? I mean, it's bigger than Watergate, I think. And as opposed to the Netanyahu stories, this involves actual crimes and a lot of money. And terrorists. I mean, it's got everything. And women. I mean, like, what's missing from this story? This is fantastic television, right? Was it ever reported? No. Why wasn't it reported? Because Channel 30, it was before the elections, and Channel 13 didn't want to report it because it would have repressed the Arab vote. And they wanted the Arabs to go to the polls because that was going to help the left wing in the election. In fact, Yesh Atid's entire campaign towards the end was towards the Arabs, and it wasn't to get them out to vote for Yesh Atid, it was to get them out to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood Party and the PLO parties. So they were part of that campaign on Channel 13, and they didn't publish this story, which is amazing from a journalistic malpractice position, and it just shows how politicized they've become. And the second story that I'll tell you, which was an interesting one, was that I guess it was Sunday night, they passed in the first reading the first two parts of this judicial reform package that, you know, this horrible fascist judicial reform package that I just set out for you. And so there was this member of Knesset from Yesh Atid who came to vote, and it was the first time that he had been in the Knesset for a couple of weeks because he had a motorcycle accident. And so there was this, on the Knesset channel on TV, they showed that, you know, he came in and Netanyahu saw him and he came out to greet him. And so this member of Knesset, I can't remember his name, he's surrounded by other members of Knesset from Yesh Atid, and they're all talking to Bibi, and they're all laughing. And also, these members of Knesset from Yesh Atid are looking at Netanyahu with admiration, okay? The media went berserk. They went berserk. How dare they talk to him? How dare they smile at him? There's this guy who was a minister in the last government, who was a minister of welfare, I think. And he is interviewed on TV for 11 minutes. And all they wanted to do was scream at him for smiling at Netanyahu. You can't make this stuff up. You know, and so, you know, I'm here now. I flew out on Sunday night, and I'm watching this on Twitter this morning, and I just can't stop laughing. It's so pathetic, right? But this is the media. The media is the primary organ of the revolution, of the rebellion, of the riots. That's what they do, and so there's no connection between facts, between news, and what we're seeing on TV today, except of course on my channel, Channel 14. But we're not going to get into that. But yeah, why not? Channel 14 is awesome. So I'm just saying that you watch the news. I can't watch it anymore. My husband watches it, and I yell at him, turn it off, turn it off. But that's what we have in our media. They've become not biased. Bias means that, you know, you report the news, you just report it in a distorted way. Here there's no news. Here they're full actors in the riots. They're pushing them, they're organizing them on live TV, they're covering them, they're telling everybody where to go to get the buses to go to the rallies and everything like that. These guys stole a tank. Did you hear about this story? They stole a tank from one of the monuments for the '73 war, Tel Saki in the Golan Heights. And then they stole a tank and they spray painted it with the word democracy on it. And then they covered it with the Declaration of Independence, which says nothing, by the way, about judicial supremacy. But anyway, and they start towing it. They've stolen a tank. What? You're bringing a tank to Jerusalem? What are you trying to say with that? And you're saying that democracy, you're going to get it through a tank? Gee, I can't figure that one out. Is that a metaphor for something? You know, while you're saying that you want a civil war? I mean, these people are lunatics, but this is a felony offense. They didn't get arrested for it. They didn't get arrested for it. These two members of Knesset, Education Minister Yoav Kish and Tali Gottlieb, who's a very outspoken member of Likud, who's on the Knesset Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, they were held hostage in their houses on Sunday morning before the vote by these people who want to be Antifa terrorists when they grow up. Okay? Now, Tali has a daughter who's severely autistic, and she went into like a psychotic fit because of the noise in the lobby of, in the hallway of their apartment building by these cry bullies who were standing outside screaming at their mother and telling her she wasn't allowed to go to work today. Then she couldn't take her child to her special needs school that day. This isn't funny. These people are criminals. They're thugs. They're violent. And nothing's happening to them because they're on the right side of justice and the media is defending them. So that's where we are today in Israel. So I agree, we are in a moment of crisis for Israel's democracy. But in order for democracy to be restored in Israel, not only do these reforms have to go through, but the second phase of reforms has to go through, and the third phase, and however many it takes, for the people who are elected by the people of Israel to govern the state of Israel and to be our lawmakers are able to do their jobs. So that's what's at stake. And like I said, the people who said that I'm Nakba lady, outside, they have something in common with Yair Lapid. They say that Israel has no right to exist, and Yair Lapid and his cronies say that it only has a right to exist if they get to be in charge. In both cases, they're denying the Jewish people our right to determine our course in the world. And both of them should be condemned. And I think that one of the most important things that diaspora Jewry can do is to say, look, we're not going to take sides in who's right, but what we do know is that it is the right of the Israeli people to have their elected representatives actually govern. And we stand by the decisions of the Israeli people and Israeli voters and by the freedom of Israel as a Jewish state and as a democratic state. So I think that those are positions that it's easy for diaspora Jews to take without taking sides. I take sides, but that's okay. Just let the voters decide, just like they decide in Canada. I might not like how Canadians vote, or I might love how Canadians vote, but I don't get a vote. Same thing in America, same thing in Canada, same thing in France. I don't know. Maybe those are the best people that can be elected. That's not for me to decide, but I can support the people of Canada having the right to decide. I can be behind the right of the American voters to decide who gets to be president or mayor or governor or dog catcher. It's their decision. It's their country. And I think that Israelis should be accorded the same respect. But in order to accord Israelis the same respect, you have to respect the fact that Israel has a right to exist and that Israelis have a right to decide. And that really, again, is the basic question in all of this. Do we or don't we? Is our existence conditional on somebody else's permission, or isn't it? Is it inherent, like it is here in Canada? Well, obviously, it's inherent, and it isn't conditional. And as a result, the people have to have a right to decide. So those are my thoughts. And I hope I haven't wasted your time on this snowy evening, but I really appreciate you guys coming out and listening. So thank you very much.
I hold in my hand the audience question microphone, and we will get to that in just one moment. You'll have to allow me to please do something in a slightly unusual order. Caroline always puts things in context the way nobody else puts things in context. And there is somebody in our audience who has been doing this for our community now for decades. Bringing in speakers, bringing in people to inform us, and for us to understand things better through the Speakers Action Group. Shirley Ann Haber is here in our audience, and I would like to ask her to come up and thank Caroline. And then I will come with the microphone.
Caroline won't remember, but I met her about 20 years ago here in Toronto, and I was totally taken and blown away by her ability to synthesize what is going on, especially in Israel, and to be able to explain it, thinking outside the box, taking all of what's happening and making sense of the whole thing. And she did that again tonight. Tonight, Caroline, when it came to speaking about a topic, you picked a hot topic. This is the topic that is going around all over, people taking sides, so many people on the left, a lot of rabbis joining to carry on demonstrations against what's happening in Israel, saying that there's something wrong with the democracy. But Caroline tonight put it all in perspective. And thank you, we can't thank you enough, Caroline, for making sense of what's really happening, because a lot of people didn't understand the judiciary and the powers that it had, and that it's all about power, and that the Knesset wasn't able to really do its job in creating laws, because then the judiciary came along and negated everything. So this was a very, very important topic. And on behalf of Paul Rotenberg, where's Paul? There he is. He did a lot to help bring Caroline here, on behalf of the Toronto Zionist Council, on behalf of the CAEF, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. It's the new name of the Speakers Action Group. And Anita Bromberg and Andrea Spindle did so much to help create tonight's event, and Sher Tefillah for giving up their space here for us tonight, and for those who are involved in the security. So many people tonight, I don't want to name them all, are involved in providing security tonight, and as well the people who are involved in doing the recording of this event. So there are a lot of thank yous, but the biggest thank you, of course, is that Caroline came here to Toronto. I didn't think she would make it. I kept phoning Anita. Did she arrive? Is she here? The weather. But she made it, and we are so thrilled that Caroline is here. And I know a lot of us here follow her. We go to her website and we listen to all the speeches. Every time we hear something on the social media, Caroline Glick is speaking, we all turn it on. And it really gives me a great deal of pleasure, Caroline, to thank you on behalf of everybody.
Thanks, Charlene.
So we can have a few questions from the audience. If anybody has a question after that very comprehensive an hour and a bit of summary of what's going on in Israel. Sure.
I'm Dr. Ed Pecos, and I really appreciate your perspective, and I read your columns all the time, and you bring reasonableness. I have two questions.
It's subjective, it's subjective.
I have two questions. Do you think it would make a difference if Israel had a proper constitution? And the second question is, do you think that Israelis, as well as many non-Israelis, have a galut mentality? That I visited there several years ago with a group of doctors who were fighting an editorial in one of the magazines on the side of the Palestinians. And I was told by one of the women showing us around, even Israelis have a galut mentality. Leave Israel, leave it to, in quotes, the native Palestinians. But we've had thousands of years of galut mentality, and about the Constitution.
So, my husband he's a native of Morocco. He made Aliyah when he was a baby with his parents, and so it's sort of a testament to Israel as really the place where the Jewish people are being reborn as a people that Jews from incredibly different backgrounds have so much in common as Israelis, that it becomes that special spice, as opposed to, an unbridgeable gap that it's very easy, the intermarriage between Israelis, Jews from all different backgrounds coming together. But one of the things that, my husband told me, which always struck a chord with me, was that there's a midrash that says that when God parted the Red Sea, and, we see this extraordinary miracle, that still the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea in 12 lanes, because we were people, but we kind of just wanted to be with our tribe, right? So that even at the greatest moment of the congealing of the Jewish people with the crossing of the Red Sea and then later in Mount Sinai, that we still all maintained a distinctive identity as members of tribes. And this is relevant for the question of constitution because, again, can you figure out basic premises that are going to guide everybody, that are going to be broad enough to be acceptable to everybody, but also explicit enough to be meaningful? And so the basic understanding that the Jews of Israel have had, up to 1992 when Aaron Barak just wrote it himself, and since, is that no, actually, we can't get explicit enough while being broadly enough based to make it meaningful. So we prefer not to have a constitution, and that's okay, and just to agree to disagree and to log roll. So I don't right now, particularly now under the circumstances, if they wanted to put together some constitutional convention, fine, we can do that. We've tried it a number of times, but the constitutions at places like the Israel Democracy Institute, which I think is a misnomer if ever there ever was one, but that they put together, I wouldn't want their constitution. There are certain things, how do you define Jewish state? What does Jewish mean? What is a state? All kinds of things that are existential questions that there isn't a broad-based acceptance of these principles. So I think it's better that we not. That's my personal opinion. And as to the galut mentality of Israelis or lack thereof, yeah, there's a lot of that going around. When you see our generals and the general staff saying that the most important security resource that we have is our alliance with the United States as opposed to our own power, then that's sort of a galut mentality. Well, no, actually, our most powerful weapon is our people. Our most powerful weapon is our military. You know what I mean? It's not the Pentagon. The Pentagon doesn't belong to us, so that can't be ours, right? So why are you saying that? Well, you're saying that because you want somebody else to protect you. So that's a galut mentality. And that's a problem that we have. But, you can take the Jew out of the galut. You can't always take the galut out of the Jew. We're a very small people, and it's easy to care about what other people are saying about you. But I think that one of the disparities that we're seeing in Israeli society that's coming to bear very clearly right now is that the 64 mandates that went to the right-wing parties are much more, are much less willing to defer to the United States or to any other outside power when it comes to issues that are of strategic importance and national importance. So I think that is something that you are seeing.
Hi, let me come at the question a little bit differently. I think something that the gentleman over here talked about Constitution. First of all, as a lawyer and a Canadian, I don't see some of the issues as problematic as you do. We have a Supreme Court which talks about reasonableness of laws, and we have a Supreme Court that knocks down, who will invalidate search warrants and go into people's homes and invalidates laws and so on. I can understand maybe there's a little bit more of that in Israel than you would like. But the issue itself, I don't see that as problematic. But maybe the problem is not one of the issues of the Knesset versus the Supreme Court in Israel, but one of parochialism versus liberalism. I don't mean parochialism in the pejorative sense, that Israel being a democracy and ultimately trying to express itself in terms of Jewishness, you're running up against a Supreme Court that wants to, in Israel, that wants to impose or to start thinking in terms of liberal values rather than the parochial values of the Jewish faith. Maybe that's the problem.
I think that there's a lot of that. I think you're right. I think one of the important books to read that makes these points very clearly in a general sense, not in a specifically Jewish sense, is Yoram Chazoni's new book, latest book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery. So I think that you'll see a lot of themes there of the tensions between nationalism and liberalism. And I think that you're right. There is a lot of that there. There was an interview with a former senior, I think she was a deputy attorney general or something, I can't remember, in Israel Hayom that came out this past weekend, and she said really that exactly what you're saying, almost word for word, that the Supreme Court is trying to impose European liberalism on Israel through its judgments. So that was that she picking up the specific words that you're using here in your question. So yes, I think that you're absolutely right. There is a tension. We see elites throughout the Western world are abjuring nationalism. Now, the problem with that is that when you just look at the basic etymology of the term democracy, right, the demos is the people. So if you're saying that there's no uniqueness to your people, but rather you're supposed to be part of a post-nationalist Western liberalism, then you're saying that a priori there's a problem with democracy because the parochialism of the people is planted in a certain geographical area and it defines a certain unique people, whether they're American or Canadian or French or Hungarian or whomever they are, or Jewish, that there is a unique character to a people. And the post-national Western liberals are saying, no, there is no uniqueness to you, and therefore we want to adjudicate not based upon national concepts and values that are shared by this particular demos, but by some universal values that exist on Mount Olympus, then yes, you have a tension. The other aspect of your question that I take issue with, and when you're saying, well, here in Canada, they also use reasonableness, well, that's too bad. I think that's wrong. I think that lawyers should base the rule of law on law and not on reasonableness or special spices. But that's my approach. But aside from that, I think, in Canada, your justices are chosen by politicians. So you have Stephen Harper, and he's going to choose a certain kind of justice. And you have the other guy, Justin. You got Justin Trudeau. I was going to say Pierre Trudeau, but I didn't. And he's going to choose different kind of justices, right? So in the end, you're going to have a Supreme Court that is mixed. And you're going to have justices who were appointed by Harper, and you're going to have justices who were appointed by Trudeau, and they're going to disagree. But the judges, but then when they're trying to come together and decide what's reasonable, they're going to have different ideas being discussed. They're going to have different value judgments being made, and hopefully, and again, I'm saying this from a position of perfect ignorance, so I can say anything, but you would assume that if you have these different perspectives being brought to bear in the adjudication of whatever dispute they're adjudicating, that it'll be reflected in the judgment. But when you have a Supreme Court that chooses itself, and you have unanimity in its ranks about what reasonable and unreasonable are, then you don't get that. And you don't have them defending their positions. I mean, one of the most stunning things that I've seen is Aaron Barak has given a number of interviews over the past month or two as part of his rallying of his forces against judicial reform. And to my mind, one of the most amazing things about these interviews is how weak his arguments were and how contradictory they were, self-contradictory. inside of the interviews themselves. What was striking to me was that this is a man who isn't used to being challenged. This is a man who hasn't had to defend his positions because he's been surrounded by an echo chamber for the past 50 years. And so, it came across very clearly in his answers to questions which weren't even that hard. His defenses of his positions were very weak. So again, you want to get the best out of people. You want them to make their best arguments. You want them to have to sit down and refine their concepts in order to be able to survive their colleagues' questionings and probes and disputes of their judgment. But if you have 15 justices and 13 of them agree on absolutely everything, and the 2 token conservatives disagree on a couple of things, then you're not going to get that kind of reasoning. You're not going to get the kind of judgment that are worthy of the people who are receiving them. So, those are my 2 cents.
Let's say the judicial reforms are passed by the Knesset, as I hope. I'm interested to know, what are your thoughts on what happens then? Won't it be appealed or be a petition to the Supreme Court to disallow them on the basis of being ultra vires, beyond their jurisdiction of the Knesset, or on the basis of being unreasonable? And then won't there be then like a standoff?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. We are in a full-blown constitutional crisis, and I think it's only going to get worse. And that's one of the reasons why what the president is doing is so important, because he's providing a basis for compromise. And if you can get, there are basically 3 actors who are driving this bus off a cliff. One of them is the Supreme Court President Esther Chayut. A second one is Yair Lapid, and a third one is Benny Gantz. And if any of those 3 puts their foot on the brakes, then we can stop careening off of the cliff that we're on right now. And all we need is for one of them to put his foot on the brake. I don't think Esther Chayut will. I don't think Yair Lapid will. Maybe Benny Gantz will. But we'll have to see. And if one of them does, if one of them joins the president and is willing to sit down and have a discussion, then you're going to have the kind of broad-based agreement on these reforms that's going to be able to survive or surmount a challenge to the court. If you don't, then, it's going to be very dicey.
What are your thoughts and feelings on Israel supplying offensive or defensive weapons to Ukraine?
I don't want to get into a long discussion of that because it's a big question. But I would refer you, first of all, before I give you a brief answer, my podcast, the Caroline Glick Show, the latest episode was just released, and I have as my guest this week my friend and colleague David Goldman, and the discussion was devoted to the whole issue of the war in Ukraine. And we didn't discuss specifically your issue, your question, so I'll give you a brief answer. So I think that Israel should not provide Ukraine with weapons. I think that we should continue. And it's not because I oppose Ukraine. I think that what Russia has done is a terrible thing. But again, no weapon that we can give is going to change the balance in that war. It's a war of attrition. And, the people who are responsible for being able to win that are the United States and NATO allies, who should have expanded their production capabilities of HIMARS and Javelins and all the rest of it, and they didn't. So, it's going to take, the Wall Street Journal reported like a month and a half ago, it's going to take the United States 13 years to produce the weapons they've already given to Ukraine. Okay, so it's a drop in the bucket for Israel to provide anything to Ukraine. It's not going to make the difference in the war, but what it will do is devastate Israel's relations with Russia, which are not great. They're terrible. But, they'll be even worse, and Russia controls the airspace over Syria. And, is now about to provide Iran with Su-35s, which are peers to the F-15s. So, how much trouble do you want Israel to get into by providing weapons that aren't going to make any difference in whatever the outcome of this war is? So I think it's irresponsible and unfair for the United States to be pressuring Israel in this way. And I think that Israel has wisely provided humanitarian relief to the Ukrainians, and that's fine. But it's not our war, and we shouldn't be fighting it. Well, we can do like one or two more.
I was wondering, in regards to Israeli immigration, I was wondering your opinion of the so-called grandfather clause, and if you think it should be changed.
So the grandfather clause that you discussed is, first of all, I have to say that I know a little bit more about the issue than I do about the Canadian Supreme Court. And so I haven't familiarized myself enough with the subject to speak authoritatively on it, but I'll just speak as a regular journalist from utter ignorance, and that'll be fine. But the grandfather clause is basically this interpretation of the law of return that says that if you have one grandparent who is Jewish, then you are eligible for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. This isn't actually clearly defined, and Golda Meir and others wanted to cancel this interpretation very early on because they said it's just an open interpretation for non-Jews to make Aliyah under the law of return. And we saw with the large Soviet Aliyah in 1989, 1990, 1991, that I think 35% of the Olim from that Aliyah were not Jewish. Under Halakha, you have thriving Christian communities in places like Petach Tikva that are comprised of Soviet emigres who made Aliyah under the law of return. The Aliyah over the past year from Ukraine, 70% of them are not Jewish. So this is opening up a whole new social problem for Israel where you have non-Jews. They're not closet non-Jews. They're not trying to hide the fact that they're Christian, that are making Aliyah based on the law of return. And this is a problem, right? This is actually becoming a problem. So I think, and then you have people in the United States who are saying, well, it's not fair because then my grandchildren who are not Jewish are not going to be able to make Aliyah. Well, no. But your children didn't marry Jews, and your grandchildren aren't being raised as Jews. And so, it gets into a lot of difficulties with that, with intermarried diaspora Jews on the one hand and non-Jews who have Jewish ancestry on the other. And I think that we should change it. I think that we shouldn't allow this to go on, because if it does, we in very short order will find ourselves with 2 million new Israelis who are not Jewish. So I think that we should really change the law. I'll tell you just one last anecdote about that. My husband teaches at this school for Olim, and most of his students are Russian. And so he was saying to them, they're saying they're not Jewish. They don't want to be Jewish. They're not interested in being Jewish. And so why don't you move? Why are you here? Why would you want to live in the Jewish state? And they said, because of the anti-Semitism in Europe.
When is the next election?
It's scheduled for 4.5 years. 4 years. 4 years and 4 months. Look, I don't think that there's any pressure inside of the coalition to fall apart. The pressure's coming from the outside, but the thing is that even if you're one of the weak links in the Likud, who's going to elect you if you bring down the government? Nobody. So there's no payoff for anybody to defect the coalition and join the left, because they won't get reelected to the Knesset if they do. So I don't think that it's going to fall now. I mean, obviously I could be wrong, but right now my gut feeling is that this government, God willing, will survive. Okay. Lots of people want to ask questions. How many people want to ask questions?
I want to ask a question.
Oh dear. All right, more questions, fine.
I think you laid out the situation very, very well this evening. And one thing that you can't seem to tell, who is funding the left? This is a cancer in Israel. This is a worse situation than being surrounded by Arabs. If we go into a civil war, it's the end of Israel. Who is funding this? They can't do this without money.
No, well, I mean, people are trying to get to the bottom of this. A lot of this is being funded by Israeli billionaires. There are several names that came up, but it's also, I'm certain, being funded by foreign governments. You know, because again,
Outside funding, or is it
yeah, I
inside?
mean, like the New Israel Fund is a primary engine of the demonstrations. The New Israel Fund is funded. 2/3 of its budget comes from American Jews, from the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, George Soros Open Society Foundation. So you're looking at the New Israel Fund, which is funded by foreign sources, and they're a major funder of the demonstrations, of the riots, of everything else. So that's one. And then, like I was saying, you know, you have over the past 5 years, foreign governments have paid 300 million shekels for their NGO agents to petition the Supreme Court against every single move by the Israeli government. So you can also assume, based on what you already know, that you have foreign governments involved in funding it as well. But again, I mean, go figure, the media isn't looking into this, right? I know it's shocking, but after what I told you about the media, they're so fantastic that you would think that they would want to know this, but of course, that's not what's happening, yes.
If I may interject on that point, as we have protesters outside, and they have every right to speak, if they have a say, as long as they do it peacefully, that's fine. The New Israel Fund is funding all kinds of things in Israel that you and I might disagree with. We might disagree with the way they do things. There is the Israel Independence Fund that very few people seem to know about that is spawning incredible organizations like Adkan, Regavim, Shomrim, all kinds of things. Look up the Israel Independence Fund. We can fund what will oppose those other funds that we don't like. But if we don't step up, if we don't oppose, if we don't come here tonight to hear Caroline, the people outside get their way. If we don't fund the Israel Independence Fund, then the New Israel Fund is going to get their way. Look it up, Israel Independence Fund, and all the organizations that they have spawned. It's incredible. They do incredible work.
Thanks so much for your talk tonight. At that point in time in Israeli history, after the PLO rejected that incredible peace offer where they had, so much, including, control of the Temple Mount, and you said that there was a moment of waking up where the Israeli left, who had supported them, realized that the PLO was bankrupt and they had nothing to offer. So when they could have gone and then re-accepted being Zionists and the whole vision of the Jewish state, but you said instead they went left and more radical. What do you think determined that move of them to the left after seeing PLO and who they were?
I think that that's an excellent question. And I think, one of the things that happened, and one of the many things that's now down the memory hole people forget, is that when Barak came back from Camp David, when Barak came back from Camp David, he said that I pulled off the mask. I pulled off Arafat's mask. Now everybody sees, right? But nobody saw, because the current wave of anti-Semitism that we all experience in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, in a very profound way that's only gotten worse from year to year. That began this wave in 2000, right? When we started seeing for the first time anti-Semitic riots on university campuses, whether Columbia, San Francisco State University, York University, what have you, and mass protests against Israel and for Hezbollah and for the PLO and for Hamas in Paris, in London, and in other countries. So that the Europeans and the American left and the Canadian left shocked us in Israel because they refused to stop funding and supporting the PLO against Israel. So it was really their mask that got pulled off in 2000, that this was never about peace. They knew full well who the PLO was, and they continued to support it after it declared and began enacting a jihad against the Jews of Israel, right? And so, that was a decision point right there, right? Is Israel going to stand up for itself and walk away from Europe? And denounce Europe for what they were doing, or was it not? And, it didn't. It didn't. In part it's economic interest, in part it's just weakness and disbelief and unwillingness to accept the difficult reality that you're faced with. I mean, there were a lot of different things at play with that. And also remember, in 2000, Israel's economy was not nearly as strong as it is in 2023. And it was also still very European-centric. Now it's much more Asian, but it was much more European-centric. And so I think that there were a lot of interests involved with the decision that was made in 100 different ways. It wasn't that somebody said, okay, we're gonna grim and bear this, or we're going to suck it up, or we're going to join our enemies, or whatever it is. I don't think anybody made that conscious decision. I mean, people on the radical left did, but they never had to be moved. They were always on the other side anyway. And so I think I think it was that when the Europeans responded the way that they did, the left went with Europe instead of with Israel.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this. I think a lot of people are not really familiar with details of what's going on in Israel. I have questions. One of them is in regards to Yair Lapid, actually. The guy is really not closed on many things that he's saying, and he contradicts himself constantly. I have seen a recording of him saying that he's totally for the reform, and then now he's leading this revolution. Heck, he said he signed the Abraham Accord. Okay, so this guy is coming from many angles that in many of them he's not even saying the truth. So a lot of the things that he's doing now are following the, Saul Larkin wrote a book about the radical revolution, the 13 principles of radical revolution, the 13 Karim, if you want to say that, which Hillary Clinton has followed, which Obama has followed, and now we see them happening in Israel. I don't think he brings a lot of value with his lack of high school diploma to work on his own. Do you think he's fueled by a larger international organizations that have interest in the changes that are occurring in Israel? That's one question. The second question, sorry, but Benjamin Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister of Israel. What happened? Like, why hasn't those changes happened until now? Why does it take him so long? Why, in the past, I think this is one of the things that everybody is saying is that he was there. Why didn't he make the changes? They didn't happen overnight. Where is he?
Okay, so regarding Lapid, first of all, yes, he made a speech at the Kohelet Forum years ago. I don't know when. It was an undated speech where he advocated many of the reforms that are now being put forward. And it's very funny when you look at the hearings of the Knesset Law and Justice Constitution Committee, Simcha Rotman, the chairman, keeps saying, people like Gideon Sa'ar or Oded Ford from Victor Lieberman's party, look, if you want, here's a compromise. Why don't I'll set aside all of my bills and I'll use the ones that you submitted to the Knesset in previous Knessets when you were on my side, right? Gideon Sa'ar put forward bills for judicial reform that are more to my liking, right, than the ones that are being debated now. And now he's one of the most outspoken opponents of judicial reform for his own reasons. And the same with Oded Ford. And, it's like a joke. All of these people who are in the opposition at one point or another in their careers supported all of these things, and now they want to go to war against. And insofar as the second question was, why didn't Netanyahu do anything earlier? So you have to understand, I alluded to it at the beginning of my remarks, I've been writing about this for over 20 years. Other people began writing about it, 15 years ago, 10 years, because it's something that people incrementally became aware of, right? He had Aaron Barak. He enacted a revolution in Israel. He transformed us from a democracy to a judistocracy or a lawyerocracy, led the rule of lawyers rather than the rule of law, when nobody was looking, right? And by the way, his actions were very controversial among the few people who understood what he was doing. Other leftist law professors at Hebrew University understood, and they actually opposed it at the time, right? Because they said, you can't do this. But nobody remembers that anymore because now they're all manning the barricades and calling for storming of the Bastille. So, but this happened in the most democratic way you can imagine, which is that people like myself started talking about it and writing about it and advocating various proposals to reform the situation so that we could restore a democracy. And over time, more and more people started talking about it and advocating on behalf of it until in the last elections, largely as a result of the collapse of the charges against Netanyahu, after he was ousted from office in what can only be viewed as a judicial coup or a legal coup. He was overthrown by lawyers, not by generals, by lawyers on trumped-up charges. So over time, in the last election, for the first time, it was building and building and building and building, but there were never 61 members of Knesset who supported it. So in 2015, everybody said, well, he had a totally right-wing government. It was only right-wing parties, except for one thing, which is that Moshe Kachlon, who was the finance minister, he had a Kulanu party, he had 10 members of Knesset in Netanyahu's government, which had, say, 63, so he had 53 without him. So they all opposed judicial reform. So there was never a government in Israel with 61 seats that all supported it. This last election, where the right wing got 64 mandates, is the first time that you've had an absolute majority of members of Knesset who are committed to judicial reform. Until now, you could never get a majority. There was never a majority. And so the minute that there's, so that's why it's happening now, and it couldn't happen in the past. That's why, because it took until now, until November 1st, for advocates for judicial reform to convince a majority of Israelis to support it. And as a result, the elections that took place on November 1st, the issue, for the first time, the decisive issue in this campaign was legal reform. It wasn't anything else. It was legal reform. It was the first time in Israeli history that this was the decisive issue in the elections, which is why, and this is just the last thing, one of the most outrageous claims of the opposition is that Israelis didn't vote for this. I only voted for this. Like, there was nothing else, as far as I was concerned, that was important, because everything that I want to do in Israel is contingent on legal reform. Everything. So, I wrote a book calling for Israel to apply its law to Judea and Samaria. Well, say we did that tomorrow. Well, the day after tomorrow, 17 European Union-funded NGOs would petition the Supreme Court to cancel the application of Israeli law in Judea and Samaria. So what did we do? I mean, we can't do that until there is reform of the judicial system and checks and balances are placed and limitations are placed on their power. Until that happens, you can't do anything else. So I'm just taking that as an example. So again, like, it takes time. And by the way, Netanyahu was one of the last people to recognize how important this is. Now they're saying he wants it in order to get out of jail. No. I mean, whatever. Like, I think that I wanted Herzog to end his trial by pardoning him and pardoning all the other defendants in this kangaroo court. But most people on the right don't want that, because the longer this trial plays out, the more abundantly obvious it is to everybody how corrupt our system is. So they don't want him to get clemency. I do, just because I think, they're using it as an excuse to oppose what we need to do, and we needed to do this before anything happened to Netanyahu, before they opened the first illegal investigation of him. So, like, I mean, I go back and forth, but I want this saga to end on the one hand, and on the other hand, its continuation is a bleeding wound. It's like an abscess that's exposing the poison of the system. So I think that I'll go either way, whatever they want. You want to continue, fine. You want to keep it going, fine. But that's why it's taken 25 years.
Finally,
Is one of what?
One of the opposition that he's in right now, that he think he coming from the left, and he's one of the corrupted people.
Everybody, I mean, yeah, whatever. Like, one of the things that these people did in order to seize power was to say they're fighting corruption. But then when you look at them, you realize that they're corrupt. So at this point, I just say, what was it James Madison wrote in the Federalist, that if all men were angels, we would have no need for government? So, okay, I think it's terrible that these people are corrupt Pauls, but I think they're all corrupt Pauls.
Thank you very much, Carol. Wonderful. It's always wonderful when you come here and speak to us. Thank you to all the organizations that put this together. Please pay attention to who they were and support them. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, thank you to organizations like the Israel Independence Fund. Please do check them out in Israel. They are very worthy of our support. Thank you to all of you for coming out to hear Caroline. And most importantly, thank you to all the people who took care of the security of this event and made sure that it could go off like this. Thank you all.